Good evening. Welcome to our online Academy Discourse this evening, which is supported by the law firm of Mason, Hayes & Curran LLP. I am Mary Canning, President of the Royal Irish Academy, and present here this evening are the Academy's Secretary, Professor Mary O'Dowd, and joining us online are the Academy Treasurer, Professor Patrick Honohan, and our Executive Director, Dr. Tony Gaynor. Academy Discourses are the oldest and most renowned series of talks in Ireland. The first discourses were actually presented in 1786. Historically, they were the occasion reserved for the most distinguished academics to first reveal and discuss their work in public. We now record these discourses, and they are available on the Academy's website. And we have been getting very many viewers for the discourses, both during them and afterwards. Before we begin, we have some short Academy business to undertake. The minutes of our last discourse, The Changing World of Money and Finance, which was a conversation between Patrick Honohan, who's a member of the Academy, and Francis Ruan, who's a member of the Academy, took place on the 6th of April 2022, and these minutes were posted online. Since our members did not inform us of any issues with these minutes, I will take them as approved, and I will sign the minute book in Academy House after the meeting. Our speakers for this evening's discourse conversation are Professor Sir Adrian Smith and Orla Feely, member of the Royal Irish Academy, and I'm delighted to welcome them both. Sir Adrian Smith is President of the Royal Society. He is also Institute Director and Chief Executive of the Alan Turing Institute. He is a mathematician with expertise in Bayesian statistics. Between 2008 and 2012, he was Director General, Knowledge and Innovation in BIS, now BEIS, and he has previously worked with the UK Higher Education Funding and Research Councils. In 2011, in the New York Honours List, he was awarded the title of Knight Bachelor. Orla Feely, member of the Royal Irish Academy, is Vice President for Research, Innovation and Impact, and a Professor of the Electronic Engineering at University College Dublin. Professor Feely is a member of the Royal Irish Academy, a Fellow of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, Engineers Ireland, and the Irish Academy of Engineering. She is the President of Engineers Ireland, a Director of the Young Scientist and Technology Exhibition, and Deputy Chair of the Higher Education Authority. Following the conversation this evening, we will all have the opportunity to ask questions, and you, our audience, if you wish to ask a question, please use the Zoom question and answer function, and we hope we have time to answer as many as we can. Now to the discourse. Sir Adrian and Professor Feely, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President. Adrian, lovely to have you here in person, which is great. It's a very interesting time for us in Irish higher education and research. There's a lot of things at play. We recently have a new department of further and higher education, research, innovation and science, a government department covering this remit for the first time. We have a new Higher Education Authority Act coming in, which is all about the governance, oversight, regulation of higher education nationally for the first time in 50 years, so that's a very big step. Our new research and innovation strategy is about to emerge. Higher education funding is very much on the agenda once again, and we've got new universities being established, so there's lots happening. You have lived, listening to your biography, you've lived several scientific lifetimes. You've got so much, I think, that you'll be able to tell us about based on your perspective, and I can share insights from the Irish side. So I was going to chronologically go through your experience of higher education and research and kind of bounce off that to give us some topics to talk about. We'll talk for about an hour, and then we'll open for questions from the audience, the small audience here in Academy House and also the online audience. So if we start off then with your first embarking on higher education, and you went to study maths and particularly statistics in Cambridge, was this a natural step for you? Was it always envisaged that you would undertake higher education?
No, I was the first in my family ever to go to university. So there wasn't that kind of cultural background and history. But I did go in the days when we had selective grammar schools in England. They were ambitious to get kids into university, compete with the public schools and so on. But I ended up in mathematics, not in some sense because I was driven and had a vision, but I was good at it and not many people were good at it. So you won all the races, and whether you wanted to or not. And I had a very early start in mathematics and numbers. I had a grandfather who was very ill and spent most of his time in bed, and I was sent as a 3, 4, 5-year-old to keep him company. And he played number games and chess with me. So by the time I went to school at the age of 5, I could do decimals and fractions and turn them one into the other and percentages and the rest. So I was marked down as a kid who was good at maths. I don't think I ever in my life up to the age of 18 sat and considered, do I care about this? Am I really interested? So you kind of drift into it, right? And certainly in terms of brand and all that kind of stuff, going to do maths at Cambridge was a bit of a feather in the family cap, and the school and so on and so forth. So one drifts into these things. But having got there, it turned out I was good at it.
Clearly, yes. And then you went into statistics, and was that again a drift or was that a conscious move?
Well, no, that's much later. You see, when I did mathematics in Cambridge in the 1960s, there was no statistics in the mathematics curriculum.
Oh, okay.
Right? Because it wasn't ancient enough to be worthy of being, algebra and geometry and beauty, truth and goodness.
Yeah.
Numbers and data and understanding the world, that was nothing to do with the maths degree. So I went into statistics at a postgraduate level.
Okay. Okay, and really interesting in the context of what we're now living through with the pandemic and how everybody is so aware of statistics, data science with its underpinning of statistics. And I know you've taken a real interest in mathematics education. You've published very influential reports on the subject. Do we educate students right in mathematics and in statistics?
Well, before we get to the education bit, there's always been data. People have played around with data to try and understand the world, whether it's in medicine or astronomy or whatever. So what's different? What's different is the vast, huge amounts of data that are flowing around in everything, right? And the fact that if you've just got a few numbers, you can plot them on the page and have a look and think, oh yeah, that's right. But if you've got zillions of this stuff per minute floating around the internet, you can't look at, how do you get to understand it? And so data has acquired a totally different significance, in all our lives, in the way we live, and it affects academic disciplines. So it's not a bad time to have a sort of statistical background. And of course, the word statistics put off a lot of people, including you, I think you told me earlier. Whereas data science and artificial intelligence, that's more sexy, isn't it?
Yeah. We were talking earlier, I was saying I've always loved mathematics as an engineer, and statistics never did anything for me in my education around statistics. It always seemed very functional. But my wonderful UCD colleague Claire Gormley, I heard her speak recently about statistics being about finding the narrative in the numbers. And that's something that I could really get into and something that I do all the time.
The narrative, the pattern, the explanation, the suggestion, the forecasts and so on and so forth. And we've been lucky, if that's a word you can apply to a pandemic. Data was absolutely dominant in all the discourse. And the public now thinks in terms of numbers, and they see people pontificate. And a lot of people did get fed up with the Prime Minister and being at a rostrum and the next slide please, and some complicated graph that nobody understood, but the public thought these guys are in charge. They're understanding what goes on. So we do live in a world which is being transformed by data, and back to things like the education system. The education system has not caught up, at least in the UK. Right?
And in Ireland.
We have a mathematics curriculum which is just as if computers and data and the internet never existed. And that's stupid per se, but it's also missing a trick, because there are more kids who get excited by data and solving problems than they are by algebraic formula. Yeah. So we desperately need a change in the curriculum. But in the UK we need something more fundamental, because we have this stupid division at the age of 16 where basically you specialise. So 80% of the kids after 16 don't continue with anything mathematical or
Okay.
data oriented
Yeah.
in the world that I've just described,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is
yeah,
all
yeah.
about data.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
So work to be done.
Yes, yes. And then when you get into higher education, where data permeates every discipline, again, we're looking at something quite different into the future of higher education then.
Yeah, we slowly, and we can't tell universities what to do, but we obviously try and influence them. I would like to see, the admissions tutors in all the disciplines be insisting on some kind of quantitative skills. And we're working on it, and I don't give up on that one. But these are embedded cultures. But disciplines, the very nature of research itself, right? If you think of humanities, if you can digitize all documents and the rest, then digital humanities and the searching and comparing and all that kind of stuff is a different world than going and sitting in a dusty library comparing one page with another to see if the commas match up.
Yeah.
We can do that stuff automatically. So I think there's a bit of a revolution, not just in the pipeline of school kids' education system, but actual impact and disruption of academic subjects in general.
Yes, yeah.
And of course, colleagues don't like to hear that.
Well, that's what we're here to talk about. Yes, yeah. And we might return to that later. Thinking still about your entry into higher education, something we're very interested in Ireland at the moment is access to higher education.
Yep.
It's about the pass between further education and higher education. It's about education as a lifelong process. Any thoughts on that?
Well, just going back personally, anecdotally, when I went to university, 5% of the age cohort went to university. 5%. In the UK, it's now roughly 50%. Now, is that a good thing? Well, it must be a good thing that people are better educated. But I suppose there's a major debate. Is a university degree necessarily the right and best form of education? And there's also a social inequality context. If only 5% went to university, I don't think the 95% felt too bad about it. If it's 50-50, it just seems to me a little more tricky. And certainly in the UK, culturally, we have not valued vocational education and apprenticeships in the same way that we have degrees, even very bad degrees in silly subjects, right? If you accept that kind of analysis. So I think there's higher and further education. We have had reports recently, and even within the Royal Society, which traditionally was not sort of in that space, much more interest now in the vocational, the technical. Even if you look at the scientific enterprise, I was much struck during the pandemic where the television cameras would focus on the giants of inventing the vaccines, right, the superstars. There in the background are armies of lab technicians and science managers, and so science is a big sort of social product, and we desperately need the technical and the vocational as well as the superstar stuff. So it might seem odd for me saying that as president of the Royal Society, but I think we're now all beginning to recognise that. So in the big debates, we've had a thing called the Auger report in the UK, which is trying to get more parity between academic and vocational and technical, and I think that's an absolutely important direction of travel. It's also related to something more fundamental, which is if we're trying to do levelling up in society, if we're trying to attract inward investment into the UK, and what every country trying to do that, the skills base is absolutely fundamental.
Yeah.
And back to the earlier thing, if the world is dominated by data and digital, those skills have to have a hell of a lot of data and digital in them. So there's a project here that we need to see through over the next few.
And I saw the recent report from the Royal Society about absorptive capacity regionally in the UK and the skills dimension. Not language I would have associated with the Royal Society in the past.
Well, I'm very pleased that we now use that kind of language looking at this. We have to see it holistically. If you go back to our rather grandiose 1660 mission, it's to support excellence in science, but also the pull through for the benefit of humanity. And if you take that latter phrase, we have to be interested in all these other dimensions.
Yes.
So in our new strategy, we're going to be.
Yeah, very good. So then following your own PhD, you went into higher education. You very rapidly moved into higher education leadership. I think you weren't yet 30 when you were appointed head of maths in Nottingham. You then went on to become head of maths in Imperial. As part of that, then you joined a senior management team. Particularly, you were involved in the merger, I know, of medical schools into Imperial. You were then headhunted on the basis of that, I think, to Queen Mary, where you were provost, and then on to the University of London as vice chancellor. And that's even before I get into your non-higher education leadership roles, which I'll also get into. So you've seen higher education from that leadership perspective from the 1970s, a time of enormous change in higher education. What are the big trends that you have noted, and the trends that will continue or perhaps change into the future?
So one of the major shifts in the UK, 70s, 80s through the 90s, was the introduction of these measurement systems on research. You know, originally the RE, the Research Assessment Exercise, and then the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, which have morphed from purely looking at research quality to impact and all the rest of it. But they weren't there before they were there. And that created a competitive dynamic that, you know, maybe Oxford and Cambridge were always competitive, you know, the boat race. The boat race, right? But it then permeated, and we now have 30 or 40 institutions that are pretty world class, and those assessment exercises did drive research culture.
And research funding.
They were a way of distributing research funding on the basis of excellence. There's now a debate as to whether that's gone too far in terms of the competition versus the cooperation. It's even a bit like football clubs poaching superstars just before, you know, so there are nonsenses. But over those decades, it transformed several dozen UK universities into research-intensive universities. So that was a major, major driver. The second thing that was going on at the same time was the creep from my 5% participation back in the 60s to 50% during the Blair government years in the UK. And that changed the dynamic within the universities in terms of a more diverse student population and new courses and so on. So it was a combined transformative thing both in research and in teaching. And the other thing that was absolutely not there back in the 60s and 70s were the vast numbers of overseas students that were being attracted, okay? Now maybe they would have always liked to have come, but maybe the universities were sniffy about it. When it became a financial imperative to get those overseas student fees, boy did the world change. So you have to see a lot of those changes also against the background of funding. The government was expanding the system dramatically in terms of student numbers, recognizing you needed to put more investment into research, but there's finite public purse. And so other ways of generating income, in particular overseas students, but also the encouragement for the universities to look more outward. We invented weird things. There was a thing called Herobic, which was higher education reach out to business and the community. And it was a fund to incentivize universities to look outside the walls and interact with others. It later became HEIF, H-E-I-F, which was the higher education, I forget what the I was, innovation or whatever. And you were rewarded for working with business and that kind of transfer. So part of it was to do with the financial stability, and then later on the introduction of student fees, which originally was an accounting trick, because if you give grants to universities, you've given away the money and it counts against public expenditure. If you give a loan, it's still your money, so it doesn't count. And that again changed the dynamic, competitive dynamic. Ministers thought that universities would compete on price, and they all charged the same price. So a series of things in terms of research culture, in terms of number of students, in terms of different financial mechanisms for funding the universities, and a huge increase in the international profile. All that in about 2 or 3 decades.
Yes, loads of points I'm going to follow up on there. Before I leave the question of higher education leadership, do you think we have good enough higher education leadership? It's a very broad question, I know, but or maybe talk about the skills that are now needed of higher education leadership.
So one consequence of major expansion, financial drivers, inevitably there's a trend there towards requiring more proper governance and management, as opposed to a kind of gentlewoman and gentleman's club of academics who take Buggins' turn to run it.
Yeah.
Still happens in a lot of universities, take Buggins' turn to run the department. I mean, if it's a vast department with 15, 20 million turnover, that might not be a very clever thing to do. So there was a requirement on competencies that wouldn't have been part of your average academic aspiration or background. So a need for good management. And then, of course, does that lead to managerialism, whatever that means?
Yes,
and did it lose the culture of collegiality and so on and so forth? And the answer has to be yes, it did.
Yeah. And was that a necessary consequence of the growth in the system, the growth of the compliance agenda?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of public money, the amounts of public money going in, whether it's directly as grants or whether it went into student loans, I mean, there's a huge amount of ultimately public underwriting money. And so you've got accountability issues which have grown and grown. So you do need governance and stuff. Then I think you're down to individuals and the way they try to run universities. You can do it in a hard-nosed managerialist way, or you can do it in a collegial way, but business-like.
Yeah.
And different universities ended up in different places, and a lot of academics did get alienated by what they saw as managerial culture.
Yeah, and there's a significant debate in Ireland around where accountability should end without encroaching too much on autonomy, which is, of course, a vital part of a higher education system.
Yeah, and I don't know enough about the system in Ireland, but in the UK, of course, you have governing bodies and councils.
Yes.
And there are compliance requirements on those councils in terms of audit functions and all the rest of it.
Yes, and we have all that here
there
as well.
is, even though we say autonomy, there's quite a lot of hands-on making sure the system doesn't do disgraceful things.
Yes, yeah.
But the dangers with this sort of bit of the conversation is you lose track of, despite all that, actually, say the research base in the UK absolutely flourished during this time.
Yeah.
And hundreds of thousands of kids got degrees and experiences that they didn't have before.
Yeah.
But the life of the individual academic did change, I think. I mean, in terms
For the
of
worse, do you think?
So, I don't know how many of them are still alive.
You don't have
I don't know how
answer.
many of them are still alive. But when I first went into university jobs, there were quite a few dossers around who didn't, they didn't do research. I don't know what they did in the afternoons, but they disappeared and so on and so forth. So there was a pretty leisurely culture in quite a bit of the system. I mean, that's a terrible thing to say, but it was true.
Okay.
And things like the ref and that did shake that up.
Yes.
And so if you liked and were cozy in that previous life, then you would say life got worse. For somebody like me, I hated that environment. I loathed it, and I liked the sharper version that came next.
Yes, yeah. And while you were in Queen Mary, you were seconded over, I'm not sure exactly the term, you went over to the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, where you became Director General for Knowledge and Innovation. It was during that time that the higher education funding settlement was arrived at. You're given a lot of credit for arriving at that or supporting that process. So I'd love to hear about that, because it's something we're talking about a lot in the Irish system, and this academy is very much central in that, this kind of tic-tac between the policy system and higher education and how we best manage that. So can you tell me about your experience?
Yeah, I have to backtrack a bit. Most of the civil service jobs in the UK, they're sort of lifer civil servants. And we have this absurd generalist thing where people move around every 4 years, so they never understand anything properly. There was one job which wasn't like that, and it was the Director General of Science and Research, which was always recruited either from universities or industry research people.
Yeah.
And I was one of the last before they changed it. So my role was basically to work with all the heads of the research councils. That's sort of looking down. That's the delivery system. And to try and influence the minister, and through the minister, the Treasury, And at one point, I should mention sort of names. It is rather dependent on who the minister is and how they champion things.
Yes.
And I was there in a very lucky time where people were absolutely clear that the research and university agenda was fundamentally important.
Okay.
So in the upward direction, I was able to do some influencing. I mean, I and many others, but I was partly in charge of making the case in the 2010 spending review for science. Now, 2010 was a couple of years after 2008, and the whole economy and
Yes.
finance of the government was in complete meltdown.
We remember it well.
In the weeks in the run-up to the actual decision-making, I was modelling cuts of 25-35% in Research Council budget.
Right.
And we were working out what would we do. We'd get out of the Antarctic, we'd get out of space.
Yeah.
So there was a little bit of shroud waving there, because the more dramatic the consequences.
Yes, of course.
Anyway, we achieved, the only bit of government achieved it was flat cash settlement, which was
Great.
So that,
Yeah.
so I take some pleasure in that. But that was the time then at the financial meltdown that the trick of changing grants to universities to loans to students.
Yes.
So I was the senior officer responsible for the modelling of that.
Okay.
And this is pretty heroic stuff, because if you remember how it works, you start paying back extra, it's like a graduate tax. You start
Yes.
paying extra once your earnings get above a certain kind of. So the heroic thing of modelling over the next 2 or 3 debates, growth in earnings, tax rates, blah, 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 blah. And what government was interested in, it was how much would you get back from the loan thing, so-called, or what you wouldn't get back, so-called RAB charge. And they were desperate that that number was less than 30. So heroic modelling led to an estimate of 29. The uncertainty bands, which were never published,
Yes.
went from 15 to 62. So I was at the centre of the sort of rescuing the research investment, but also that transformation of student finance.
Right.
Which wasn't my policy, but I had to do the arithmetic.
Yes, yes. And how did you find being in the department and in terms of convincing ministers, and I think you were saying there have been something like 5 science ministers in the UK in the last 27 months or something like that?
Now,
Now,
yeah,
yes.
absolutely.
Yeah. And certainly any conversations I've ever had with politicians or senior civil servants in Ireland, everybody gets the importance of higher education, everybody gets the importance of research. It's where we fall on the scale of priorities that is the issue. And you have to convince a minister to take a viewpoint longer than the electoral cycle, because, you know, the loss of the Antarctic or space or whatever, you know, it may not be felt in the next year or two.
But they're
it's in the next 10 or
irreversible if you
20
get into
years.
that
Exactly.
territory.
Yes. Yeah. So it's not always the easiest case to make, because you are expecting people to look from other priorities that have much louder voices, much more obvious statistics, perhaps beds and, you know, people in trolleys in hospitals. How do you make that case for higher education and research?
However eloquent you might be as Director General for Science and Research, you're not going to win unless you've got a minister who gets it.
Yeah.
And I was very fortunate. I had the last 2 years of our Labour government under Gordon Brown, and then I had the 2 years of the coalition, if you remember.
Yes.
And I had the same minister for those 2 years in the coalition.
Right, yes.
Who was very respected and close to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Treasury.
Yeah.
So you had a seamless buy-in
Yeah.
from a minister and a Treasury that was listening.
Yes.
So, you know, any eloquence of mine would have been as naught if we didn't have that.
Yeah.
All right, but I supplied them, if you like, with the evidence and the arguments that they used. So, the one lesson I've learned, unless you have ministerial champions who get it, it's much more difficult.
Yes.
And I was fortunate at that time, as you remarked, and rather private grief in the last few years. We just had 5 science ministers in 27 months.
Yes.
We now have a bit of stability.
Okay. Yes,
Say no more.
and that academic policy interface, what you described there is the gold standard, okay? Having a leading academic statistician move into the department and have great sway within that department, okay? We're in a sliding scale from that back to kind of very casual interactions, you know, in Ireland at the moment. We're trying to see, how do we position this right? How do we get appropriate transfer of knowledge from academia into the policy system, and indeed vice versa? So again, you've described the gold standard. What are the other mechanisms that you need around that?
There's a lot of other bits that we didn't talk about. We've, for a long time, had somebody called a government chief scientific advisor.
Yes, of course.
Right? Who's got independent-minded, has the ear of the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Of course, that only works if the Prime Minister's interested.
Yes.
And some aren't.
Yes.
And what we did then was we've cascaded down through all government departments. There is a chief scientific advisor in all government departments.
Yeah.
So if you like, that's his gang. The government, or his or her, the government chief scientific advisor has this gang of chief scientific advisors. So you've got the gadfly within all departments constantly looking at what can science tell us, you know, about the policy space.
Yeah, and are these people normally seconded from academia?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, usually do 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
Or academia or business.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So that's an important bit of the structure.
Yeah.
The other bit is down at the coalface, as it were, the research councils and the agencies that actually distribute the money and choose the grant, you know, priorities and the rest of it. Where I oversaw that as Director General for Science and Research. And then we changed the system later into the so-called UKRI, UK Research and Innovation, where instead of it being, it was me as a Director General negotiating and cajoling the research councils, there's now a formal structure where there is a boss of the bosses.
Yeah.
And we are doing a major review, as you know, at the moment, as to whether that has worked.
Yeah.
And what we might do to improve it.
And because that is very, very current for us in Ireland at the moment. What's the general sense, not necessarily your personal sense, but what's the general sense about how that federated approach is working?
At one level, people will say we've merely set up another level of bureaucracy.
Okay.
So over and above the individual research councils that have their own councils and decision making, we've now got another layer.
Yeah.
So there is a perception, rightly or wrongly, that we have dramatically increased the bureaucracy around these things.
Okay.
From top down, I think there's increased pressure from cabinet officers and treasuries for accountability. So there is much more reviewing of stuff on a regular basis. You know, the Alan Turing Institute that I've been running since 2018, I've been reviewed 4 times in that, you know, and this is for peanuts. These are tens of millions of pounds out of a £9 billion budget. So a lot of people would think we've got the gearing of letting the system run and trusting people and the level of accountability and bureaucracy. But, you know, academics would always say that anyway. I mean, they might be right, but they will say that anyway because they don't like to be accounted.
And that's a very strong sentiment in Ireland at the moment as well, that the level of reviewing, the level of research bureaucracy is getting in the way of conducting excellent research rather than facilitating and rewarding it. And I take your point that academics may always be inclined to say that, but I think that there is something to be examined here.
Yeah, well, there's a rather paradoxical thing because we've got a new kid on the block now in the UK, an agency pseudo-modelled on the DARPA American, you know, mission-driven, bureaucracy-free, let it rip, which we've called ARIA. I can never remember what ARIA stands for. But it's set up with that kind of model. So bureaucracy-free, long-term decision, you know, long-term investment, not constant. The things say, this is a great thing. Well, if that's such a great thing, the academic community is saying, well, why are you piling on the bureaucracy in all the other parts of the system then? Because if freeing it up is a good idea, why don't you free it up? Anyway, those are live debates as we speak.
Yes, here as well as with you. Yes, and Sir Paul Nurse is doing a review as well of your research and innovation structures.
If you stand back and look at, take UKRI and dispensing its 9 billion or whatever it is, where does it go? Well, a hell of a lot of it goes into universities. But we also have facilities like synchrotrons.
Yes,
And,
yeah.
And we also have other public sector research establishments, the Met Office. We've got various kind of Faraday Institute on batteries, Rosalind Franklin Institute on biomedical pull-through, and so on and so forth. So the landscape doesn't just consist of universities. It's got institute, public sector research establishments, NGOs, medical charities. So you could ask the question, you know, we spend a certain amount in universities, is that right amount? Are universities the right mechanism for driving the system? Now, what's the system? Well, it's research and innovation. Now, maybe the universities are clearly great at driving the research. The challenge posed is, do they get in the way of innovation? For example, by hanging on to intellectual property, or making it tricky for academics to move into industry and back again, and so on and so forth. So that's the sort of thing, looking at the landscape, rather than the amounts of money, do we distribute it in a way which maximizes both R and I?
Yes.
And what's happened in recent years is much more of an interest and focus on the innovation bit of the agenda. Everybody said, we're great at research. It may not be true, but I mean, you know, we're great at research, the universities are fabulous, but we're not very good at pulling it through into prosperity.
Okay.
Which may not necessarily be not true, actually. But anyway, the image is they're great in the States, we're terrible in the UK. So what do we need to do to drive the innovation part of the agenda? And that's the sort of debate that's going on at the moment, and may result in different ways of using the money and where you put it.
Yeah.
Big debates about intellectual property.
Yes.
People take very opposed views. We've kind of encouraged virtually every university now has a technology transfer office.
Yes, of course, yes.
And we've encouraged them to see if they can make a buck or two out of the IP. It's actually rather odd, because as a taxpayer, I funded the research that did it. Why is the university making money out of what I funded? You know, why doesn't the IP go back to the research councils? Or, you know, all these debates are going on, and the more extreme version says IP gets in the way anyway. Just get it out there.
Yeah.
That's live debate.
Yes, yes. And certainly in Ireland, the compliance agenda would run very counter to that. We are being asked to account for the money that goes into the inventions that arise and to show a return on investment on that taxpayer investment. So look, all these dynamics are as live with us as they are with you.
So I don't, maybe you know, I don't know anywhere in the world that makes huge amounts of money out of this. MIT, 3% of turnover.
I know.
The more important thing might be encouraging entrepreneurship in the academics. That might be the real plus.
And in the students and the graduates.
And in the students.
Yes, yeah.
But these are unresolved issues. It was such a mess some years ago that Richard Lambert actually did a report with sort of 5 models of how you might do IP. Speaking as the director of the Turing Institute, where the Turing model, we have academics seconded from all our university partners. If you get into IP territory, I have 5 different universities with 5 different IP rules.
Yeah.
So there is a sense in which there's an issue there.
Yeah, and we're very familiar with that.
What are the
in Ireland
blockages?
also. Yeah.
Some of the blockages are IP, some is the porosity of careers. We haven't quite cracked how to get people comfortable in it, almost to be the norm, that you can have an academic connection but also work in business.
Yes,
and so on and
yes.
so forth. So that's another bit of the agenda.
And what would we need to change in higher education to get that right? I mean,
different people give you one crude answer in the past would have been pensions, that the university pension scheme was very generous and so on and so forth, and you know,
we won't go there.
There's more of a jungle out there in the private sector, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I think there are cultural things.
Yes, yeah.
And if your academic promotion is based on that purely academic thing of fabulous papers and grants and all the rest of it, you're going to disrupt that sort of trajectory if you go off and start a company up for a couple of years or things. So there are cultural and reward systems that need rethinking. those are owned by the universities. So a lot of this goes back to thinking about the way the universities operate. Well, back to your original question.
Yes.
We're all thinking about the nature of the universities, how they operate.
Yes. Yeah. And then to talk about the Turing Institute, and maybe you might say a few words about it for those who are not so familiar with the Turing, just to tell people about its model and its scale and so on.
Yeah, so it's the National Institute for Data Science and AI, and it basically has three objectives. One is to broker, convene and drive the research agenda in these new areas that we don't understand, data science and algorithms. And the second is to get pull-through from that to solve really big challenges, like could we totally reform the NHS if we drove it through digital data and algorithms rather than doctors and pieces of paper. And the third thing, training the generation of the future. We just need enormously more people who are savvy. There's a wonderful background accompaniment.
There is, yes.
It's good.
Something outside, bagpipes or similar.
It sounds celebratory, so let's celebrate the fact then we need to create a lot more people awareness of data science, AI, and so on and so on. Those are the three objectives. And we've operated in the past with university partners who second to us academics that we can convene in gangs to do the challenges, whether it be climate, whether it be health, whatever. We call them Turing Fellows, and I've got about over 400 academics, in different bits and pieces, 20%, 50%, 80%. So that's how it's operated. We're trying to change that going forward because it's quite transactional working with university partners on that basis. And we're trying to get core discretionary funding so that we can expand the work. But it's there really to drive. We've got a kind of national strategy for AI and data science, running all the way from being a research powerhouse through to how do you transform businesses through data and the rest. So it's quite ambitious. And we're a pretty young institution and lots more to do.
And again, because that's something that's been very much a part of our landscape, the kind of, cross-cutting research institute model or research centre model versus the research within individual institutions. And there can be a tension between them, is people's allegiance, is it to their home university, is it to their cross-cutting centre? So what's your sense?
So
and also the scale.
Issue is scale. Right? If you are looking at the challenges that are posed through climate change, the scale of the problem and the data, you can't handle this as an individual academic or an individual university department. And of course you could search for your mates and all the rest of it, but that's a kind of difficult business. So having something at the center whose very purpose is to broker and convene people into getting to the challenges, and also where the challenges come from. We've got major programs in defense and security. The defense and security agencies aren't going to deal with individual academics or universities. The whole health system is just on a scale. The individual universities could do, cancer or kidneys or whatever, but the system level stuff is just at a scale. So scale is very important in these things. We talked earlier, big data, vast data. This is not little projects. These are massive things. And so there is a tension, of course.
Yes. But and again, particularly for us in a country the size of Ireland, the sense is that you have to collaborate if we in Ireland are to make an impact on the global stage. So that's part of our argument.
Some of us make in the UK.
I
mean, particularly with the issues arising with dissociation from Europe. You look at America, you look at China, you look at the EU, we're a little minnow. I don't know how big you feel, but
we're a little minnow off the side of a little minnow.
The UK is more pretentious, but it's small, right? So what can we compete in? What can we actually be good at? And nothing unless we do it at scale. And then getting back to the whole issue of digitalisation and the impact on higher education, we started to touch on that earlier. I mean, you're in the cockpit there, the Alan Turing Institute. You're seeing the ramifications of data science, which have so much transformative power in all areas of life, including in higher education.
and even research. You started to touch on it there earlier. You know, how will research look when we have more artificial intelligence, augmented intelligence involved in the conduct of research? You know, how much of research of what we think of as creativity or genius, how much is the actual human spark, and how much is very advanced pattern matching that artificial intelligence can do better?
So the classical one, obviously, is medical diagnosis, right? We have junior doctors, always seem to be an insulting term, but never mind. And then we have consultants. So what makes a consultant? In essence, it's somebody who's seen more cases and remembered the correlations better. Well, an algorithm can. Yeah. So what can you better do with algorithms, and then what do you better use the humans? So we're not doing substitution stuff with, you know. So, but diagnosis is an obvious one. We have a major project we call Living with Machines, which is the digitization of all print records relating to the Industrial Revolution. Okay. So, and you get that mass of stuff, and the ability to search and relate and so on. So this is the biggest experiment so far in the transformational effect of digital humanities and the use of data science.
Yeah.
And we have similar things going on in health.
Yes. Yeah. So what's your sense of how digitization is going to transform research?
To be honest, I don't know. I mean, that's part of the fascination of all this.
Yes.
It's really an unknown, and how individual academics will respond, you know, to these kind of challenges. And to be honest, it's very much a generational thing.
Yeah.
A younger generation embraces this a lot more.
Yeah.
I mean, my son, who's a humanities scholar, is equally at home working with digital things and synchrotrons and the rest of it, whereas older members of the department would prefer to be in the library turning pages.
Yes, and again the implications...
No disrespect to humanities scholars.
Or to the wonderful book pages behind us here. Yes, yeah, and implications for the way that we run higher education, the way that we think about disciplines and really run interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity in a way that perhaps we've only talked about up until now.
Yeah, well, you can start at different levels, can you? My own view is that every at undergraduate level, in every discipline, there needs to be core understanding of the digital and the data, and then you can nuance it in terms of the different disciplines of what that means. And that's just basically getting awareness and education. In terms of the research agenda, I mean, it is occupying most of the research councils, including the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which actually has been funding the Living with Machines.
Right, yes.
But, you know, digital humanities is a big, issue.
Yeah.
You take the Natural Environmental Research Council, they've got enormous databases, you know, ice cores from Antarctic, and, you know, there's miles of ice cores sitting in warehouses. That's data.
Yes, yes.
So I think we're just beginning to grope at it. And of course, if you're to get at and use that data transformatively, that requires investment and money.
Yes.
And if there's a finite research pot, and it goes there, it won't go into some of the more conventional routes.
Yes,
so
indeed.
This is disruptive.
Yeah. And the whole question of the social sciences and behavioural sciences and how they intersect with data science, that's a hugely exciting one.
Yeah, so I didn't mention in the context of Turing, but we don't see it as, you know, algorithmic techie stuff. We have gangs of social scientists, behavioural scientists, political scientists, economists, and professors of ethics.
Yes.
Because the understanding and the transparency of algorithms, you know, DeepMind produced an algorithm which beat the world chess champion, beat the world Go champion, and basically they proudly say, we don't understand how they did it.
Yeah.
If you're going to operate on me surgically, I'd like to quite understand how the algorithm came to the conclusion that you're going to whip this bit out or that bit out. So explainability and transparency is a huge issue, because the whole nature of these AI things is they are big black boxes and nobody understands what they do. So there's a wonderful kind of issue to be resolved.
Yes.
And also public acceptance, public understanding.
Yes.
So there's a whole sort of social and behavioural thing. As we move towards driverless cars, we'll get the kind of absurdity that the first time a driverless car kills somebody, it'll be horror, not noticing that driverless cars probably kill fewer people than human drivers would.
Yeah.
So, you know, so there's a whole set of social and cultural debates and understandings to be had.
And the whole issue of how human bias appears within the algorithm.
Yeah. So, you know, the classical thing that you get headhunters and, you know, HR turning their stuff into an algorithm, and it's just as biased and stupid as the decisions they made in the first place. So understanding bias is fundamentally important and actually becomes a techie thing in itself. How do you technically recognize that data sets have got biases in them?
Yeah.
And then,
Yes, and then how about how we run higher education and how that will be different in a much more digital world? And we've already stuck our toe into these waters now through the pandemic, and we have moved things online in a way that we would never have thought that we could, with such rapidity and with such success, I think it's fair to say. But we're now starting to see some consequences. Certainly in any university that I interact with, people are finding that students are disengaged in a way that has not been ever seen before, not attending lectures, not even engaging with the online content. There has been something that seems to have changed. Now, whether that is an immediate post-pandemic consequence that will rectify itself, or whether we do need to think differently about how we engage students, how we develop students who've grown up on screens. And again, you and the Turing are very familiar with that world of screens. So any thoughts on that?
well, the boring thing I said earlier, I don't think we know yet. I mean, this is new territory. I always thought before the pandemic that having 200 kids in the lecture room and talking at them didn't seem to me a very clever way of, you know, imparting information.
Other than maybe from the bursar's perspective.
Maybe we'll learn what's optimally done online and available in that form, because of course you can then, if you didn't quite understand something, you can stop the video and go back and rerun it and so on. And there are quite interesting experiments that have been done at Stanford with online things, and people can vary the speed at which they run it, and they adjust it to their own kind of learning parameters. So I think there are very positive things that could come out of it. The human kind of interaction bit, if you believe, you know, that student parties and getting drunk is part of the cultural learning process, then you might mourn the absence of that in the last couple of years. So I think we'll learn and adjust, but I'm pretty sure that lots of people have been damaged in the last couple of years. They've had a less rich experience. And really interesting to see how higher education evolves, and there will be first movers here, and there will be people who try different approaches. We have to make sure that we as researchers look at what is working, what is not working, and That's
modify
an internal
accordingly.
view. Externally, if you're in a finance department or a treasury, won't you be thinking, couldn't we learn how to do things much more cheaply and efficiently?
Yes, I know, But
So, you know, either we get ahead of the game or we'll have it done to us.
exactly, yes, another one then, again, talking about the Treasury perspective, globalisation. We talked about that earlier. We talked about how higher education has been changed for the better in so many ways through globalisation, through having new perspectives, the movement of international students around the world. It has really transformed higher education in this part of the world and in the UK. You know, I think people are starting to look now at this in a more worrisome geopolitical context and all the dimensions that brings. How does globalisation now look, do you think, in terms of higher education and its future and risks that are maybe being opened up?
So the general geopolitical context in which you have different systems and different values, and some people regard others as good guys, bad guys, etc., etc. That's a given. That's the world as is. And one of the things we've been talking about in this building earlier today, the notion of academic freedom and what does that mean when you've got contrasting cultures and value systems and so on and so forth. So it's the negotiation of what is the space in which we can maximize contact and cooperation against the background of either governments telling us not to deal with those bad guys or whatever. And I think that is a moving feast. What we do know, I mean, just take the UK, government worries about the nature and purpose of all the Chinese students who are in the university system. You talk to any vice-chancellor, they will say they fundamentally enrich the university experience for everybody, even if they have been sent over to try and nick your IP, which is probably worthless anyway.
Okay.
Did I say that? I can take that one back.
And internationalisation in research, you did a very significant report on that. Again, a very live topic for us in Ireland at the moment, the Brexit context, looking at UK association with Horizon Europe, also looking more positively at North-South cooperation on this island, something that we are very, very, very excited about. What are your current thoughts about that?
Well, there are several elements to that, right? So there's a lot of metrics that if you take citation as a metric, you don't have to, but if you do, then highly cited and a lot of evidence that things which have sort of international gangs of authors get more highly, high, you know, there's a quality metric in that, right? So that's something per se. Then you get down to individual relationships, and before I come to the private grief for the UK of Brexit, etc.
Rather public grief, I'd have to say.
Just Royal Society runs some pretty prestigious journals, and I only found out I didn't know these statistics, 40% of all the submissions to the Royal Society journals come from China, and 30% of those that are accepted for publication. Okay. This is an extraordinary, you know, as a measure of what's happening in China. I said earlier today, 25% of the world's R&D workforce is in China. Yeah. The investment levels are absolutely incredible. So if we're in a space where challenges are global, we need to work globally, we need to share data globally, we need to cooperate globally, you cannot not work with China. Yeah. So it's a matter of how you do it and what the parameters and who decides what and so on. And there can be a tension between a government trying to push you one way and universities, academics and the Royal Society trying to maximise back the other way. Yeah. So I think that's rather general in terms of global and collaboration. In terms of the private grief, of course, Brexit happened, right? Most of the academic community were not in a Brexit space. Post-Brexit, there was the hope that we would be associating with European programs. The deal was signed on Christmas Eve in 2020, or whenever it was. And the final signature and agreement has not happened because the Commission will not sign that off unless and until the Irish Protocol issue is solved. Yeah. So it's playing politics with something which is nothing to do with the science enterprise per se. Okay. So it's been deeply frustrating for all the academies and others who've been arguing this is just damaging to the scientific enterprise. It's nothing to do, the issue is nothing to do with science. Yeah. You know? But that's the politics of the EU, and the French are particularly exercised about this. So we are actually drifting towards a state where it may not happen. Yeah. 100 UK researchers who've got awards under the ERC have received a letter saying if they don't move to an EU country by the end of July, the awards will be taken away. Yeah. The UK government has said, okay, we'll underwrite it financially, but we all know it's so much more than a purely financial transaction. Of course. So we are drifting into something which is deeply damaging both to the UK and to European academia. Yeah. But one feels powerless to influence the President of France.
Right, indeed. Yes, yes. So I'm going to open up to questions now. Before I do that, are you optimistic for the future of higher education? At this time, you've built your career, such an illustrious career within higher education and research. There is a view one sometimes hears that we're coming to the end of a golden era, if you like, for higher education since World War II, the kind of research-intensive universities, the status, the standing that they hold, almost the monopoly they hold in terms of research and you know, education at a certain point. Is that the case? Maybe that's not a bad thing if the case. What's your view? Are we heading into big disruptive territories?
We touched earlier on sort of higher, further, academic, vocational, technical. I personally think things will move much more in that direction. 50% of the population doesn't go to university or do apprenticeships. So 50% of the population post 18 is not doing continuing education. And if you take seriously the need for adaptive careers, lifelong learning, etc., I think, maybe in 10, 20 years' time, we'll think it was very old-fashioned to be using terms like higher education and further education. There's simply education.
Yeah. But one would expect and hope, I think, that our systems that have been so resilient, since the time of the monasteries, that have evolved, that have adapted, that, we are adaptive, creative people, that we will adapt to new realities and deliver something that ultimately will be better.
We're talking ownership of knowledge in a certain sense, right? Now, maybe that will pass to tech giants, or Elon Musk, or Jeff Bezos.
Yes.
I mean, the computing power of DeepMind is not, no university can compete with it.
And the resources that they can pile into artificial intelligence.
Salaries, resources.
Exactly. How does the Turing compete? You're in a space that is so populated by those hugely wealthy industrial giants. How do you compete?
Well, the strategy has to be not to view it competitively or pessimistically, but to try and work jointly.
Yeah.
Because an awful lot of people who might get big salaries in DeepMind actually value academic connection and
they
new
have
ideas.
come out of fine academic traditions.
Yeah. So I think universities have to get the fluidity and the porosity of working with the wider world. So it's not, are you working in the university or in DeepMind?
Yeah.
It's, they're clever people who spend their time in different bits of the space.
Yes, yeah.
And that would need some transformation of culture in HE.
Yes, yeah. So exciting times. Yes, very good. So let's see what questions have come in. Might throw it open first of all within the room here to see if anybody would like to pose a question. Dan Carey. And I'll repeat the question in case people don't pick Dan up on the mic.
Yeah, thanks very much. Fascinating talk. A couple of things that you didn't touch on that you might comment on comparing the UK situation to our own. There's a movement in Ireland for new technical universities, and the UK has gone through that transformation of the polytechnics becoming universities. So I wondered if you had any reflections on that process. The other unrelated question is about academic freedom, academic tenure in the UK and its elimination and what the significance of that for the UK system.
Okay.
Sorry.
You might want to...
Yes, and I won't be able to repeat nearly the length of that.
Yeah,
Dan, you talk first.
The former polytechnics becoming universities
Yes.
in the UK and the question of academic tenure in the UK.
Yes, indeed. So again, for those who didn't pick it up, the former polytechnics becoming universities and the question of tenure in the UK.
So these are personal views. I think there was a drift towards some homogenization when the polys became universities, aspiring to be like universities as opposed to be like polys. And some of us think there was a serious, great role for polys, both in the sort of vocational technical, but also as local anchors. Remind me the second bit?
Yeah, about tenure.
Tenure. So tenure was formally abolished in the UK in about 1986. And it's not clear to me that that had some overwhelmingly negative effect on academic freedom. What it did mean, of course, was that if you were running a university and you had strategies and aspirations of what you wanted to achieve, it did mean that those who weren't lined up with those strategies and directions of travel would not really find a place in the future. Now, you can either regard that as positive or negative. Because it changed, it's back to that thing earlier about changing the whole dynamic. That transformation to about 40 really quite serious research universities would not have happened without that.
Lots of really interesting questions. I see a few more in the room here, and I'll take one or two online first of all. So first of all, Anita Maguire, one of the most important ways in which university research supports economic and societal growth is through developing high-level skills in the people who progress out to different roles, PhD graduates and postdocs with high-level research skills. Is there sufficient recognition of this as a major impact of research investment in parallel with the value of the research results and the focus on protecting IP? So that talent agenda from research, do we value that enough? Do we do enough in support of it?
I can only say the current perceptions and discussions, certainly from the Royal Society point of view, certainly from what people have found valuable in the Horizon programs and ERC, is investment in people. And I think we get it, and I think everybody gets that. And there are several kind of groups in the UK looking at talent as a kind of shorthand for to succeed. You know, the phrase, the UK needs to be a magnet for international talent.
Yes.
So people and talent, I think we get it.
Yeah. And do we do enough to form talent through research? Do we think, because of course we know that most of our PhDs do not end up in academic roles, so do we do enough in planning our PhD structures to develop the competencies, the skills that they're going to need in the workforce?
So there's the nitty-gritty of what's a PhD program and all the rest of it. I mean, all I can say from the point of view of Turing, we run enrichment stuff. From the point of view of government investment, the latest announcement, we're going to create 1,000 more PhD places in AI.
Yeah.
So, those are signals.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we've had great success in Ireland with centres for doctoral training within data science in various manifestations, bringing in cohorts, developing them as cohorts, bringing industry into the process, having very structured formation of these graduates. They've worked very well for us.
Yep. Well, we've got 1,000 new funding for 1,000 new places, and these will be bid for, I guess, in CDTs.
Yeah. Another question here: what do you think works well in research culture today? It's something we didn't get to touch on yet. The whole question of culture within higher education, culture in research, and what do you think is the biggest problem or area of concern?
I don't know whether it's a problem, but there's a direction of travel going back to things I've said several times. The really big challenges are challenges at scale, and I think the drift from the individual great researcher to teams, interdisciplinary teams, I think that's an inevitable direction of travel. And the structures within universities and funding have not caught up really with the flexibility and the agility to support that.
Yeah.
We still have problem in evaluating interdisciplinary research in research exercises.
Yeah. And the whole notion of equality, diversity, inclusion, dignity and respect in research, again, it's an environment that can be very problematic in this regard because it's so hierarchical. There is such a power imbalance between those who are working together. Yep. So any thoughts about that?
It is fundamentally important that we make progress in that area, and it is a problem, structural and cultural.
Yeah. Okay. Here's an interesting one. If you're able to make two major changes now in universities with no barriers to change, so kind of utopia, in order to position the sector for a strong medium to longer term future, what would those two major changes be? Let us for the moment give you a superpower to do this.
God, need notice of that one. I honestly don't know that there are these single silver bullets. So much of it is to do with structures and cultures and breaking down of barriers that you can't legislate for. I think disciplinary silos are a major kind of issue. If there were some way to incentivize breaking down those kind of barriers. I mean, just the way in the UK at least, I mean, we've got the horror of division of GCSEs and A-levels and, all that kind of stuff. But, if you go to the United States, you can do a major, a minor, I think getting more of the flavour of the liberal arts flexibilities into serious research universities, if I knew how to do that, I would.
That's your superpower.
Do it, yeah.
Okay, great. We'll go back to the room now. I think, Mary, you had a question?
Yeah, I just want to ask from the perspective of Belfast. which obviously is in the UK. The association, a European association idea, obviously has serious consequences for us. If your gloomy forecast about what's going to happen and that the EU doesn't recognise the UK as an associate country, is there a plan B? You're saying the government will provide funding for the current ERC awardees, but is there, I mean, are you as a leader in research or other people thinking about how they're going to replace the EU collaborative research programs? I know you mentioned is it the arena? I forget the name, ARIA or
The ARIA, yeah.
big thing, but that's going to be for a small number of people.
Yeah.
It's not going to replace EU funding.
No.
I'll just repeat the question maybe for Mary O'Dowd from the perspective of Belfast, that what you describe about the perhaps, gloomy signals around association of the UK with Horizon Europe would be very worrying, as they are, of course, in the UK more broadly, and indeed for us in Ireland here. So is there a plan B that might be in gestation as to what would replace this source of funding, and all the international collaborations that it brings, not just the quantum of money, but what it signifies?
Yeah, so in relation to the EU, yes, there is a lot of thinking about what would be the mechanisms, in particular in something like ERC. You could mimic the same kind of offer or make it even more glittery. The problem with that is that it's not, of course, just the money, it's the prestige thing. And the other worrying thing is that in the context of Europe as a whole, you've got the whole of Europe as your peer review expertise, right? If you're setting up a parallel system, where do you get the peer review expertise and the international buy-in? So I think certainly sufficient planning to mimic the funding, because if we weren't joining, we've got 2.3 billion a year, which was the joining fee that we could use for other purposes. But it's kind of hard to get away from, this is not a purely financial arithmetic issue. It's much more kind of cultural in terms of networking and that. Not for all disciplines, but I would have thought that we still think the overwhelming majority of UK academics would want to associate and are deeply worried about not associating.
Yeah. Another interesting question here from Anna Murphy. I'm curious about the role of admin cadres in higher education, especially in the digital environment, academic integrity, etc., and given their proximity to students. Are they undervalued? It's something that I've seen discussed quite a bit recently, the binary divide between the academic and the non-academic, or the academic and the professional support staff. Even the language here is sometimes problematic. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that goes back to university leadership. If you allow these kind of academic versus admin cultural divisions to happen, then you get what you deserve. So you have to set a kind of tone of mutual respect, and one depends on the other. It's back a bit to the thing I said about science as a social enterprise, the armies of research technicians and so on. There would not be vaccines without them.
Yes, of course.
Right.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
let's respect the individual contributions.
Yes. Yeah. I'm curious about what both of us, Adrian, think the physical campus will look like going forward.
Well, you go first then, because this question you.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose you have to look, first of all, there is a big physical campus investment to date. So we're not going to depart overnight from what we currently have. But I think that, the kind of blending of disciplines and that you talk about will undoubtedly have to have an effect on our campuses in terms of, rather than people locked off in offices, people in much more open plan areas specifically designed to share ideas. The whole question of the post-pandemic environment, are people going to continue to work from home to a large extent? That will have a very big impact on our campuses. Are students going to come back to campuses to the same extent? Will there be fewer bodies on campuses? What does that mean in terms of office accommodation? So just a few immediate thoughts.
Without knowing the precise answers to that, I think there's an inevitable direction of travel, isn't there? If I were looking at capital investment budgets in a university, I would be closely scrutinizing anything that was going into lecture rooms or offices, and I'd be trying to see what I could cleverly do by investing it in digital resource.
Yeah. Yeah, so because certainly in many campuses we are feeling pressures, more students on campus need more space, more academics, more research activity, you need more space, and yet there might be the germ of a solution there in the working from home. So, if we can manage this right, I think there is a future that could be
I would certainly press a
win-win.
pause button on big capital building investment.
And given the construction inflation, that might be not a bad time to press a pause button. Thank you, Adrian Orla. Very interesting talk so far. May I ask, what is your take on an industry-led university education for job readiness versus a more rounded approach to education that likely has a greater effect on social transformation?
I don't think it's either or. I mean, why do we try and have one size fits all? Why couldn't there be, if you take apprenticeships versus degrees, the blend of work experience and that. So I just think we need a more blended system and get away from either or and is this better than that. Go back to the individual. For some individuals, I mean, the apprenticeship route, just behaviourally and socially and in all sorts of ways is great, and for others it might not be. So I think a different set of offerings that individuals could opt into to suit their own sort of attitudes, lifestyles, whatever. To me, that would involve, if there's a finite amount of resource to go in, fewer degrees, more apprenticeships.
Yeah, and we're hearing blended coming up a lot. We're talking about blending across all sorts of boundaries, I think, in our conversation here this evening. Here's another one from Felicity Maxwell. Any advice for researchers on fixed-term contracts or junior admin staff or public servants who wish for sustainable careers in higher education and to make a positive difference in the system? How to be heard by university management or government?
Well, partly university management, but some of it, if you're talking about early career researchers, are the nature and lengths of grants that are awarded. So if you have a series of 3-year grants, you're living hand to mouth and it's difficult to plan. So I think we might radically re-look at what's the norm of kind of investment in projects and programs. So instead of sort of 3 years worth, maybe fewer, but 5 years or 7 years or whatever. So finding ways of it is a big issue for the Royal Society, is how we get a more sustainable career structure. So within the Royal Society, for example, we have these university research fellows which are early career researchers. Our bid in the spending review was for mid-career fellowships, so that you've got a sustainable path to move onto.
Yes, and again, that's something we're very conscious of in Ireland, that you need the ladder, you need the availability of funding, of opportunity at all levels to build careers.
See a career structure the whole way through.
Yeah.
We haven't got that right yet.
Yes, okay. Any more questions from the floor here? Philip Nolan,
I just wondered, surprisingly this isn't a research question, but it's I'm drawn very much back to the curriculum. And I just wonder, are we on the cusp of a very radical transformation of the second and post-secondary curriculum, which explicitly focuses more on skills, actually, skills that the different disciplines have been teaching us. And as the disciplines get larger and larger, we often tend to forget the fact that at the core there is these skills, numbers and their abstractions, text and language and their abstractions, image and their abstractions. I'm almost optimistic for the fact that we will reach a crisis where we have to think about what statistics and economics teaches us and abstract the core from that, and we start there. So we call them literacies, but I think literacies tends to be a bit dismissive of the depth of the skill.
Well, years ago,
Adrian, we might just repeat the question. Yes, a really interesting question from Philip Nolan about, as we look to very radical new curricula, might we be abstracting from traditional disciplines to look more closely at the fundamental core skills involved, sometimes called literacies, and think in that term, that more abstract term, rather than in terms of thinking of the perhaps siloed disciplines that we've been living with?
Yeah, so I've done various reports on maths education and failed entirely to land most of what, but tried at one stage to be constantly using, instead of talking about math, talking about quantitative literacy. And I think we could get that back on the agenda, because it could then subsume understanding natures and varieties of data, and what you can and can't do with data, and what the ethical and other issues are around it. There's almost a strand of education for the citizen in terms of something like that. And I think there's, I can't say one is going to land it in the near future, but I did mention this kind of stuff when the Secretary of State for Education was at a meeting I was at, and he subsequently invited me in to talk more about it. So I think people are interested. There's a bigger and bigger interest in what you might call a skills agenda, as opposed to an education agenda.
Yeah.
The
And again,
Department for Education has never had any interest in skills. The current Secretary of State says he does have an interest in skills.
Yeah, and again, that's very much the same in Ireland at this time as well. Although there's lots of questions coming in online, I think we're at time now, so maybe just to finish up, Adrian, is there any last message that you would like to leave us with?
If I had a single word that we would keep coming back to, which is transforming the world around us and posing issues about conventional things like disciplines and learning and that, it's data. The age of data.
Okay, and how we respond within higher education, within research, within society more broadly.
We have to respond, but first of all, we need many more people to understand the nature of and the implications of both positive and negative. Yeah.
So we're right back to our very first question about your getting into maths and statistics and the career that has led you to.
Yep.
Yes. Yeah. And we've talked a lot as well about boundaries and about bending boundaries and blurring boundaries and working across boundaries, and it does seem that is also going to be part of our future.
I think one of the really big obstacles in data are disciplinary silos, not just in terms of content, but modes of thinking. And you need the mode of thinking to...
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's the point that Philip was making earlier,
Yes.
about a kind of core abstracted.
Yes,
Yep.
yes. Well, Adrian, thank you so much for sharing your insights from your stellar career with us this evening. I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and I'm going to hand back to the President now to close the event.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Orla. Well, I'm going to thank Sir Adrian and Professor Feely. I think you will all agree that she did a fantastic job of asking the questions, and you, Sir Adrian, did a fantastic job of talking about data and how it broadens our horizons in many different ways. I took a few learnings. We're not allowed to say learnings. I learned a lot. I think your comment on the effect of the pandemic on students is only beginning to be known anecdotally now, but we are beginning to hear about it anecdotally, that there are huge gaps, psychological and learning gaps, and I see Orla nodding there. I think that was one I would have loved to have pursued further, and of course we don't have time. I think the damage of non-participation of the UK in Horizon 2020 is something that has really worried us all greatly. You and I discussed this in London when I was there, Sir Adrian. We have tried through the Academy and through our work with other academies to make this known across Europe and to argue the case that we cannot, in the interests of humanity, shut out certain groups of researchers from others and stunt those partnerships. So we in the Academy have tried very hard to make that case. Your point about skills and apprenticeship and boundaries has been one that anybody who's listened to me over the years here has heard me talk about a great deal. It's a huge issue, and unfortunately it's still not very popular, I think. And yet we are in Ireland and now experiencing huge labour market shortages. How did that happen? Well, where did our apprenticeship training go? And so I think there are big lessons there for policymakers. We've had a superb roundtable discussion with you on academic freedom earlier, and we've tired you out very much, I'm sure, but I think in the light of what is happening around the world, nothing has become more evident than the importance of academic freedom at the moment, and indeed of evidence-based research. We didn't really organise the bagpipes to play you through, but it was a good idea, except they came at the wrong time. So thank you so much. I want to thank our sponsors, Mason, Hayes and Curran, and without their support, these discourses could not go forward in the Academy, and we share ideas and with an ever-widening audience, because in the meeting hall, which at the moment is under renovation, we could probably seat comfortably 100 people. Here we are reaching so many more people, and so thank you very much for your support. To the Secretary, Mary O'Dowd, who's here tonight, organises the Academy's Discourse programme, a very big thank you. The next discourse will be Tuberculosis, the Persistent Global Scourge of Humanity, with Dr. Lalita Ramakrishnan, Professor of Immunology and Infectious Diseases at the University of Cambridge, and that will take place online on Thursday, the 26th of May at 6 p.m. And I hope all of you who have joined us remotely this evening will tune in again. Further information and booking details are available on the Academy website, www.oria.ie. And I hope you will be able to join us. In the meantime, stay safe. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to both Orla and to Adrian. Thank you very much.